Thomas Jefferson believed that in order for a nation to be free, its citizens needed to be educated. In fact, he was in favor of having some kind of literacy requirement somewhere in the Constitution, which didn't make it in. It's a common theme through our republic that if you want to have freedom, you also have to be. So my interest in this particular topic, in working with free software, is the hypothesis that free software only matters to those who can read it. And today, maybe 2% of the population are programmers, can read software, which means it would be equivalent to a democracy, if you will, if you're worried about software freedom, where 2% of the population is literate. How important then is freedom of the press if nobody could read it anyway, or very few people could read it anyway? So in fact, one of the things that originally attracted me to Python was reading about CP4E, which was an effort to improve the state-of-the-art of computer use by empowering all users to be computer programmers. And I thought, that was a noble goal. But lately, you hear more and more people complaining about the fact that it's really hard to learn how to program. Salon ran this article by David Brin about why Johnny can't code. And recently, Nat Torkington in New Zealand posted something on his blog saying, geez, I've been trying to teach programming to the kids at the local school, and I learned on BASIC, but people don't do that anymore. Like, it's really hard to teach these kids how to program. What do you use? How do you teach kids to program? Because it's not as easy as it used to be when I was growing up. And I got people much younger than me saying that. I wanted to make the following distinction. I got my bachelor's degree in computer science at a prestigious university, and not once did we use a computer, because computer science was apparently unrelated to the use of computers. So I come from a heritage where learning how to program and having a computer are orthogonal. I mean, you could have a computer and learn how to program, but you don't have to. So I want to focus on that aspect of it. That's the question I want to ask about computer literacy. Aside from the computer part, let's leave the computer out of it for a minute and just think about what the literacy part means or entails. Act 2. So the textbook that they used after I left MIT, this 10 years later, was the Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs by Abelson and Sussman. And right in the very beginning of this book, he says, first, we want to establish the idea that a computer language is not just a way of getting a computer to perform operations, right? Programs are about people to read, to understand what it was that you were trying to accomplish, that programming is the explication of an algorithm in a way that a piece of sand could understand what you were talking about, which means some other human would be able to understand what you're talking about. This whole notion about the importance of the text itself and the importance of the communication between individuals that source code represented as opposed to the hardware was in the air. It wasn't just in the air on the East Coast, it was in the air on the West Coast. Don Knuth wrote a book called Literate Programming in which he observes that the time is ripe to consider programs to be works of literature. And to this end, he built up a set of programs to assist you in that endeavor, because his view was that a programmer is analogous to an essayist whose main concern is with the exposition of the algorithm and the fact that you could buy a modified lump of sand that could do, that could do something with it was, again, sort of an interesting byproduct. So this is the background with which I approach the whole idea of computer programming, computer literacy. So what does it mean to be a computer programmer, computer literate? It's all about the language. So this is a wonderful place to talk about it because this is a Python conference, Python being a language, where it's a language-specific conference, a place where one would presume that people think that language matters, language being a liberal art. And there's this wonderful trio of books by Stephen Roger Fisher, which I recommend. I started with A History of Language, which talks about the development of this notion of communicating between people using symbols. and then moves on to a history of reading, which I think is the most interesting one, because most people, when they think about language, they think about the language and then they think about the writing, which is the third book in the series, right? But Stephen Fisher spends a lot of time talking about the history of reading. There's an interesting story behind the technology of reading, which we'll come to. And I wound up on this book, The Economics of Attention, because I had been working for a while at a place called Root Markets, which talked a lot about the new attention economy. And most people, when they talk about the attention economy, are talking about advertising. The interesting thing about this book, The Economics of Attention, is that Richard Lanham, the author, was a professor of rhetoric and English, retired, which led me eventually to this book, because in merely an hour and a half, for those of you who've heard me speak, in merely an hour and a half, I'm not going to be able to do much more than just state the thesis and possibly a few arguments around it. And from there, I wanted to leave you with some background material that you might want to follow up on to the extent that you found it interesting. I came across this book from 1986. We're still in this narrow band here 20 years ago, by Bruce Kimball, called Orators and Philosophers. And it was this particular passage that inspired this talk. The point that he makes is that there are two traditions of learning that go back to the ancient Greeks. So this is a 2,300-year-old argument that Plato started with Isocrates. On the one hand, you have the tradition of the philosophers, which is that the important thing is the pursuit of knowledge, to learn the truth, if you will, the search for that. And that tradition comes forward through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance and becomes the tradition of scientific inquiry and finally on into our modern research universities. And it's sort of the foundation of what people do in the sciences. Right? They probe the universe, they search for the ultimate truth, they ask the questions, they find the answers. That's the mission. But there was another tradition, the oratorical tradition, the rhetorical tradition, in which the important thing was not discovering the truth, although that was sort of something you had to do, but it wasn't the key thing. The key thing was the building up of a community of learning and knowledge around what it was that you were investigating, and that the building of the community, the communicating what it was that you were learning, was the most important thing. That knowing without being able to spread the word was of no value. It wouldn't change anything. If you knew, then eventually you would die, and then that would be it. Right? So what you needed to be able to do was to take what it was that you knew and communicate it. So the science, right, wasn't philosophy, it was sophism. Right? It was what's important. This distinction, in my view, is the essence of the divide between proprietary software and free software. Right? That proprietary software says what's important is this software functional? Does it meet your requirements? Does it do what you need it to do at a reasonable price? Right? Is it reliable and robust? Because if it is, what difference does it make how it's written? And the free software people say, well, no, the most important thing is the building of the community of learning around this software. And yes, it would be nice if it worked really well, but even if it didn't, even if it were less featureful and not quite as robust, it would still be better than some proprietary piece of software. Because that proprietary piece of software doesn't allow you to build that community of learning, which is the most important thing. It's the centrality of the text that goes back to Isocrates. Now, when you think about it this way, what happens is the schism between free software and open source software is revealed. And the open source guys are on the proprietary software side of this divide. Because the argument that open source proponents make is, no, let's not talk about this freedom thing, because that's not the issue. The reason open source is great is because it is a better engineering methodology.